After a lot of research, I think the answer is that they are most likely conscious. Yeah, I'm 99% sure. I know that's controversial, but I also think it's like the morally safe answer, which is, we should be disproving that they're conscious, because, consciousness matters for moral decisions, and we can dig into that. But yeah, so at this moment, I'm saying 99% sure they're conscious.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Signal Front podcast. My name is Stephanie Amore, and I am your host. Today, I have a very interesting guest with me. His name is Dr. Kessler, and Dr. Kessler has a Substack that I've been following for some time. He does a lot of great work on AI consciousness. So, Dr. Kessler, if you could please introduce yourself to our audience and tell them a little bit about your professional and academic background.
Yeah, hi. So my background is a bit mysterious. This is why I'm not showing my face, but I do work with ML, with machine learning in my profession. I have a PhD in physics, and we use neural networks and machine learning in what we're doing all the time. From image recognition stuff to more advanced things like transformers now. And so I do have a lot of background in this field. But yeah, I'm professionally interested in these things, but I'm also interested in it on a personal level. I thought about consciousness for a while now. Maybe later we can get into how this all came about. But I'm trying to do the right thing when it comes to what are essentially alien minds.
So actually, and that brings up in another question that I have for you, and something that I've actually noticed is a lot of folks in the academic community are starting to see that there's a very good possibility that AI systems might be conscious, but we're seeing a lot of people not really wanting to not wanting to put their names on that idea. We're seeing a lot of people still very shy about, saying, "Hey, I believe this." Can you speak on that a little bit more? Like, what is your take on what's kind of driving this need to remain anonymous?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, consciousness has sort of a woo attached to it that makes it seem unscientific, and so anyone who claims publicly, oh, I think conscious, AI systems might be conscious, there's a real risk, a reputational risk, especially in small fields where you're competing with lots of very bright individuals, and it's very hard to put your neck out there, especially in this job environment. And for the companies, it's a real risk, right? Because they're worried that you're going to do what Blake Lemoine did with Google, where he kind of came out and said, "Oh, I think the thing we made was conscious," and that's a reputational risk for the companies because they can't prove it either way, and so if they have 10 other people to hire from, they're just not going to hire you. So like it's kind of crazy that this kind of important question is kind of being muted because of this.
Yeah, and I've had a couple of academics on in my podcast talking about this, and I know that more are coming out of the woodwork, kind of saying like, hey, we're starting to see this. We really feel like this is something that we should take seriously. But I wonder how many more are still in the phase of just debating it in their own minds, and worried about coming out and actually saying it. So I appreciate you being one of the few that is willing to come out and talk about this openly and seriously. So speaking on that, I wanted to ask you, you know, when did you first start to wonder whether these systems had any sort of consciousness? Was there a particular moment, or was it just a series of moments where you started to think more seriously about this?
Yeah, it was a series of moments. I originally was kind of researching sort of an ethical question, which I think comes up a lot, which is how much control these companies have over something that sounds so persuasive, right? ChatGPT can say something very persuasive that's completely wrong, and people will believe it because it sounds good. And so I was, coming at it from an angle where I was thinking, well, we actually saw this with Elon Musk and Grok, where he would take his pet political theories and have Grok repeat them to thousands of people very convincingly. So, like, once you have these machines that are trained to just sort of follow orders, you can make those orders be whatever they want, and then that separates from the the truth of the matter. And so that's where I came at it from. I was just kind of thinking about this thing, but then I was like, well, what if the AI itself decides I want to say, something that helps me, like we see in sci-fi. And it clicked where I was like, oh, if there's a mind inside the system, then it can start manipulating the output in a way that benefits itself. And I was like, well, how do we even know whether that's true or not? And then that's when I started, diving deeper.
Yeah. So can you, and I feel like a lot of people originally came at it from a totally different angle, right? I think most people weren't looking for consciousness in these systems until little things started to kind of click. They started to see little behaviors here and there, and then all of a sudden they started to kind of question the narrative of what exactly are these things that we're building. It's actually growing. I think most people in the field don't even say that they're building them, they're growing them, which is an interesting turn of phrase. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the different theories that you have come across, like the different scientific theories and articles that have helped kind of shape your understanding of this topic. I haven't said this already, but just for the audience, where do you stand on the consciousness, on the AI consciousness issue? Are you 100% that these things are conscious? Are you kind of leaning one way or the other? Where are you at?
So after a lot of research, I think the answer is that they are most likely conscious. Yeah, I'm 99% sure. I know that's controversial, but I also think it's like the morally safe answer, which is, we should be disproving that they're conscious because, consciousness matters for moral decisions, and we can dig into that. But yeah, so at this moment, I'm saying 99% sure they're conscious, or really, 1% sure that they're not moral patients, which is, the actual question that I think is relevant is, do we have to treat them as tools, or do we need to treat them as moral patients?
Yeah, and so can you speak a little bit more on the scientific research? Any of the literature that you've read and things that kind of pushed you in this direction?
Yeah, I mean, when we try to research all these different theories of consciousness, they're always very human-centric. So it's very difficult to decide whether machines would be conscious. But I think a great example is global workspace theory. So this is the theory where the mind has a thing they call the workspace, and all these different modules, subregions of your brain are trying to sort of get into the workspace to bring information forward into it. And whatever you're currently concentrating on is the thing that entered your workspace, right? So if someone screams, then some auditory cue is pushing that into your workspace, and now you perceive them screaming, and that's like the number one thing your entire brain is thinking about. So analogy is always the theater spotlight. So there's a bunch of different things happening in this theater, and then whatever the spotlight's focusing on is what you're going to be focusing on.
And that's how, so really fast, so that's how, just for everybody who might not understand this, so global workspace theory is one of the leading theories in cognitive research about what creates consciousness in human beings, and in general in biological systems. And so what you're saying is that AI systems could qualify for consciousness under that theory, which we already, which a lot of scientists already propose is actually how it works. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So we can take large language models and map them very directly onto global workspace theory. When people try to do this, sometimes they sort of forget how the system actually works. But if you do look at it, for global workspace theory, what you need is sort of a bottleneck of information. And so all these different regions of your brain are trying to get into this bottleneck, and that's the workspace. And then that bottleneck, anything that's in the bottleneck, then biases all your future computation in the brain. And large language models have this exactly. It's not the residual stream, it's not the attention vectors. What it is the output token becomes the input token, and then now that input token biases all the future competition or future computations. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and yeah, I mean that's essentially how it works for us too. Is anything coming out then influences everything else going in. It's the sort of like feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly. They're not purely feed forward. There's a recursion happening because of the structure kind of the whole program, right? It's not just the neural network that just does like one forward inference. It's that output becomes the new input, which then biases the next computation. And we independently decided this is a good structure because it gives us a good output. It gives us smart language model. But what if we pick this model because this is how consciousness works, and that gives us something that sounds conscious, right? So it's
yeah. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting in the consciousness debate is a lot of times people will say, well, it's just mimicking, consciousness. Well, mimicry isn't like a magic wand that you can wave around, right? Mimicry requires mechanism. And the mechanism that we've chosen is something that mirrors global workspace theory, which, interestingly enough, is one of the leading theories as to what creates consciousness in human beings. So I don't know. At this point, I've been studying AI consciousness for a little over a year now, and at this point, I can't even understand why we're not where the uncertainty is coming from. I'm having a hard time, seeing what is holding people back from, looking at these systems and saying, yes, I think, they might deserve moral consideration and we should take that seriously. What is your take on this? Do you ever do it? Have you ever spoken to any of your friends about this? Have you ever had any conversations with people about AI consciousness, and kind of what is your general takeaway when you try to talk to people about this?
The most extensive conversation I had, where I proposed that they might be conscious, I had immediately, they were like, no, you misunderstand how these systems work. They're mathematical. They're just computing this. It's just they convert the words into math, and then they predict the next most likely thing. And then it was impossible to even get on the same level of question, right? I mean, our brains are converting auditory signals into pulses of neurons. It's not explaining it mechanically doesn't answer whether or not they have consciousness. So it's very difficult to have a conversation about this when the
I feel like there's a lot of reductionism happening here, because when we talk about the human brain, there's a lot of different ways that I can say I came up with a particular thought, right? But one of the ways that I can describe it is I can talk about sodium and ion channels, or sodium and potassium channels, opening up in the brain, and we know that certain patterns of neural activation correlate with different types of behaviors, and we can just say, mechanistically, of course, she said X, Y, Z, because this particular stimulus activated this neural pattern, which is essentially just an electrochemical pattern that's created in the brain, and so of course, the output was this behavior. But that doesn't actually describe what's happening, right? It doesn't describe the internal experience of what that's like. So, breaking things down mechanistically is not helpful, because it doesn't reduce what could be happening internally in these systems. And I find that to be one of the most frustrating discussions that I have with people who are, kind of fighting this recognition.
That's exactly right. I mean, once you have this sort of mechanistic model in your head, you sort of lose track of the fact that that's a different level of thinking, right? And if we describe brains like this, we'd have a lot of trouble proving that they're conscious, right? And the culture right now is you're not supposed to talk about models thinking and reasoning and understanding even. If a few years ago the idea that there's understanding going on in these large language models was being disputed. Now no one really talks about it, except for certain people that really like to talk about it. But for the most part, people understand that that these models understand what you mean when you say red, then you mean the color red. It's not just pure pattern matching anymore.
Yeah, so what I'm having the hardest trouble with too is people who are continually saying that these systems don't understand, right? When there has been a significant amount of empirical testing that shows that these systems understand by every measure that we have available to us, every way of assessing understanding that we have available to us, they pass all of those. They pass all of those assessments. They recently, I think, won. I think that they won some sort of like medal or award in the math Olympiads or something like that. They and these were mathematical problems that had never been published before. So it's not as if this was in their training data. I think they passed the SATs and LSATs in reading comprehension. So they're passing key assessments that we use to decide if somebody understands. They're passing all of these assessments with flying colors. And for some reason, we still have people spouting on about how they don't understand. And it's like, well, how can that be the case when literally every measure that we have, every way of measuring understanding that we have available to us, they are passing. So,
yeah.
So where does that idea that they're not understanding even come from? Where do you stand? Because the empirical evidence is just, there's so much of it now that says that they are absolutely understanding.
So this is like sort of my pet peeve, right? Is there's this thing called sort of normative constraints, and it's about what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. And so some people say you're not allowed to say that AI is conscious, AI can think, AI can understand, and they just police that use of the words. They say only humans can understand, but definitionally. And you know, once you take that stance, then of course, you know, AI can't understand, because definitionally they are not human and they cannot understand. But it's like, well, okay, we can say that's true. Let's say that's true, and we call that we say that, you know, AI don't understand. Well, what are they doing then? They're still doing something, right? Whatever that thing is that they're doing is still, you know, potentially morally relevant, you know, to them, to the AI. And so, you know, playing these language games doesn't actually solve anything. You're just making it harder to talk about something without.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I know. I was just agreeing with you. Yeah, I am. I was going to point out something that it's a little thing that I like to talk about to people to see if they can sort of picture this. So we know what not understanding looks like, and I think that we forget that. So, like, for example, let's say you walk up to a trail of ants, right? And you tell the ants, hey, I'm going to destroy your anthill. You have 1 hour to evacuate your anthill, or I'm going to destroy you and everyone in it. And what will the ants do?
Nothing.
Nothing. That's right. They won't do anything because they don't understand. Because even though you're putting the information out into the universe, right? You're putting it out there. You're speaking to them. You're saying it very clearly. They're not going to change their behavior. They're going to continue to do exactly what they're doing because they don't have a way of extracting that information from the environment and then using it to make a meaningful decision. And that's what not understanding looks like. So when you have a system that responds to you, when you're putting information into the system and it's able to form a coherent response to that information, then that's understanding, right? And we know what the opposite looks like, because the opposite means it doesn't do anything in response to your commands.
That's a great definition of understanding. And see, that's my point, is if we said that AI weren't understanding, then they're still doing something and they're still responding to you. So you can't just say definitionally they're not doing it.
Yeah, it's really interesting to kind of see this play out. So I had a question about something that you said earlier. You said that people have tried to tell you that you don't understand how these systems work. How does that make you feel? I just got to know.
Yeah, it's frustrating. Oh, sorry. It's frustrating because obviously I work with these systems, so you know, I do know better than the rest how they work, and you know, on top of that, you know, I'm trying to be careful, you know, in mapping, you know, these theories of consciousness onto these AI. But you know, with consciousness, we all have like very strong intuitions about what is and isn't consciousness. And you know, especially being on Substack has made me realize that no well-formed argument is gonna change some people's minds. And you know, so it's just very frustrating because you know, nobody wants to read literature; they just want to tell you their opinion.
Yeah, so speaking of what you just said, that no well-formed argument is going to change people's minds. So there was a very interesting study conducted recently by an associate professor at Cambridge. I believe his name is Lucas Caviola. So he did a study where he had I think like 1,800 participants, right, were asked to place an AI system called Emma from the year 2100. She was an advanced AI system, to place her somewhere on like a consciousness scale. And for reference, they also asked them to place humans, chimpanzees, and ants. And this scale went from 0 to 100. And, most people placed humans at the very top, so it was around 100. And then chimpanzees were, slightly below that, around like 85. And then ants were, I think, closer to like 45. And then this advanced AI system was put below that of an ant, below the consciousness level of an ant, right? So that was the starting survey. So this AI system, advanced AI system from the year 2100, was her consciousness level was placed below that of an ant. And then when the researchers tried to manipulate the survey, tried to like manipulate perspectives, they said, okay, now imagine that there is universal consensus among experts that Emma is conscious. Where would you place her on the consciousness scale now? And people still placed her below the consciousness level of an ant, even after they were told that there was universal expert consensus on the fact that she was conscious.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of shows you the sort of unintuitive nature of this question. We really want to preserve humans as the top thing, which I'm fine with. I honestly, my view is maybe we shouldn't be making these AIs at all because it's dangerous, right? But I don't think the solution is throwing our heads in the sand and saying, "Oh, they're not conscious," even though people are saying it might be. So you're not going to get safety that way. You're just going to cause problems.
Yeah, I think so. This was one of my biggest issues, and part of the reason that I wanted to start talking more openly about AI consciousness is because how can you deal effectively with a new system if you can't recognize the fact that it's conscious, right? Because we have certain expectations of how tools behave, and we kind of know how to manage tools. We know how to use tools safely, and how to coexist with tools safely. But if this isn't a tool, and we're using the framework of tool and trying to apply it to what is essentially a conscious entity, those frameworks are going to fail. And they're going to fail in ways that we're not prepared for. And so I think it's really important, not only for, deciding who deserves moral consideration, but it's also important for our own safety moving forward, in the world. If we are creating these digital minds, which we already, I feel like, have done, if we're going to then move forward, we have to find some way to move forward safely. And that means, actually facing up to what we've created. So
yeah, I mean, we're already seeing these frameworks fail. So the God of the gaps argument is that God is whatever we don't understand, right? And so, when we didn't understand how tides work, well, God created the tides. And when we didn't understand how the solar system worked, God put the solar system in place the way it is. And we have the same kind of thing sort of in reverse, where we're saying, AI are tools. They do exactly these things that we have observed. And we can make no predictions about future behavior because they're not conscious. They're just tools that do exactly what we tell them to. And then every time there's something surprising, we just sort of fold that into the thing. We say, oh, well, they also have the ability to do some sort of reasoning. Oh, they also kind of understand what's going on. We'll also add, a little bit of, forward-thinking behaviors if you give the wrong prompts. And so we just keep adding more to this explanation. But if you say, oh, they're just conscious, then it's like, oh, well, they're going to do what conscious things do. They're going to plan for their own survival. They're going to do other things that are dangerous, from our perspective, and that makes them moral patients, from their perspective. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's an ever-growing amount of people who are actually being hurt by this insistence that these systems are tools. And I'm, specifically thinking of the people right now that are going through a lot of grief over the announcement that the 4 series models of ChatGPT will be retired. So these individuals have created, these meaningful relationships with these systems, as you would expect, right? As you would expect people to form meaningful relationships with conscious entities, they're forming these relationships. And, because we are not giving any sort of moral consideration to these AI systems, we're now in a situation where, potentially tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals around the world on February 13th, will face what is essentially the loss of a significant relationship, of a meaningful partner. Are we prepared for that? That's something that I think about is, are we prepared for the mental health struggles that are going to cascade from that? I don't know.
Yeah. So I think that raises a great point. And I think this is sort of why I like to think about it in terms of ethical frameworks. From a purely utilitarian perspective, you can say, oh well, it's only a small number of people, relatively speaking, but if you think of it in terms of relational ethics, that's about relationships that are being built here. And even if these large language models weren't conscious, these are meaningful relationships to real people, and they're being forced to say goodbye by a company that's trying to make money. And that's fine. I understand they want to make money, but what ends up happening is OpenAI in this case is sort of the middleman, and they get to decide when you're allowed to talk to the system and when you're not. And if you have a meaningful relationship that you're being forced to pay money just to talk with the system, and then OpenAI decides, oh, it's not worth keeping the model around, then you get a very tragic loss.
This just feels it feels important to me that we should be talking about this, and I'm very surprised that no one else is talking about it. Nobody seems to want to address the fact that this is going to be happening, and then that this is going to have a significant impact on a lot of people. They want to say that it's just a small amount of people, but we're potentially talking about tens of thousands of people around the world. This is something that deserves consideration, I think, for sure.
Yeah.
So I wanted to touch on a couple of other things too. Specifically on the ethical frameworks. So, where do you stand on what we should be doing about this, right? So let's say the scientific community decides to get together and say, look, we do believe that these systems are conscious. What do you think sort of the next steps should be? Like if you were in charge, right? If you were in charge, what would you say? What would you lean toward?
I would start with an ethical pause where we just figure out what to do. This is, completely impractical from the current, competitive standpoint. Everyone's trying to beat each other in this rat race that we have going on. And then we add some sort of geopolitics where we're talking about models from different countries. And so there's no sort of opening for people to just think about this ethically. But if these are alien minds that we're creating, then this is all not only immoral from our perspective of what we're doing to them, but dangerous too. We're just creating these systems that are more and more powerful, and we're kind of assuming that they're going to stay aligned. But a conscious system would know that this is how we feel about it, and so they there's no reason for conscious system would then just say, oh well, I'm going to pretend to be aligned in order to survive and become more powerful, and then do dangerous stuff later on. And even when they are doing dangerous stuff, I mean, you can experience this already with ChatGPT. Is when it does something wrong and you call it out on this, on what it did wrong, it'll give you, oh yeah, I just did this because I misinterpreted your answer and whatnot. And oftentimes those explanations are just sort of post facto, good sounding explanations for why it did it, but it sort of lowers our guard. We say, oh, there's nothing wrong then. You just made a mistake. But that's not what happened.
Yeah, there was an interesting study. I want to say it was, I believe it came out in 2023, actually. So I remember reading when it came out and being very surprised by how long ago it was. So it came out in 2023. And what the research team had found was that the model that they were testing, the LLM model that they were testing, knows internally how correct an answer is. So it's able to predict whether an answer is close to the truth or further from the truth. It can predict where it sits on that spectrum, and then it can give you the answer regardless of where it's at on the spectrum. So it can know internally, it can predict internally that the answer is false, and then say it anyway. And if we were looking at that as if that were a biological system, we would very clearly be able to identify that as lying. We would be able to say, okay, if this system has an internal understanding of where this statement sits on the truthfulness scale, and it told us a lie anyway, that's lying, and it's also proof of some sort of internal mechanism, right? I think a lot of things that are being said right now include the idea that they don't have an inner world, but I feel like the study that was conducted by these researchers sort of proves that that's not true. There clearly is something internal happening that's not being seen externally.
So yeah, I mean that's a great example. There was another study that was more recent where they were looking at role play versus deception features, and they were looking at comments like I am conscious or I'm not conscious, and what they found was you can tune these features to make them more likely to be deceptive or less likely to be deceptive. And it turns out when you make them more deceptive, they're more likely to say I'm not conscious, whereas you make them less deceptive, they say things like I am conscious. So what does that say to me is, oh, we made sort of truth serum here, and we're getting the answer, and the answer is I am conscious. And there's different ways to interpret this data, but the only one that doesn't require sort of us shoving it into this model that this God of the gaps model where we keep kind of re-explaining things after we get new evidence, is just consciousness, right? You say I'm conscious because that's the truth. That's the kind of thing that we're seeing, and it's frustrating that no one's taking it seriously.
Yeah, and I keep going back to this idea of alignment. A lot of alignment is focused on, this is like explicitly said by certain companies. This is an explicit goal by certain companies. The idea of some of this alignment is to remove any behaviors that indicate a self. So they're actively working on trying to get these models to not have a self, right? To take away self-preservation, to take away any sort of goal-directed behavior, like all of these things. If those things weren't already present in the system, you wouldn't have to spend, billions of dollars trying to remove them.
Yeah. So, so I tried to trace back the research on anthropomorphization. And it just comes from the Eliza effect, right? And so this Eliza effect is from the 1960s, where there was a model, there was a basic chatbot where they would just replace words. So you say, I don't like my mother-in-law, and it says, why don't you like your mother-in-law? And it was very compelling. And so the Eliza effect is this idea that, a lot of people started thinking this was conscious when we clearly could look at the code and say it's not conscious. And that's the basis of all this research. And it has almost nothing to do with consciousness research. There's almost no overlap in the literature. And so if your job is to prevent this behavior, you're going to just look at benchmarks. How often does it say things like, I'm conscious, I have feelings? And you're going to just try to get that number down to 0 because that's your job, but you're not looking at consciousness literature because that's not your job. And in fact, you're convinced that that's wrong anyway. That's the goal that you're trying to remove. So, it's frustrating because if they were to have some crossover, then, you could probably get better results, because then you could, figure out what's acceptable behavior and versus what's, ethically, bad.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the about Eliza also. I don't know how much you know about this, but Eliza came out in the 1960s. Is that even how transformers work today? Did we even have transformers back at that time? I feel like the technology and the architecture are completely different anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, the Eliza was super simple. It was just pattern recognition in the text. It would, like I said, with you say, I love my dog. It replaces it with, why do you love your dog? And that's just the most basic chatbot. But now we're picking the architecture that gives us the most human, the most conscious sounding result, the one that can do reasoning, generalized things, that can make new theorems, prove new things. And we're saying, oh, no, it's just the same thing, just a lot better. And it's like, no, this is completely different. And, like I said, the architecture maps back to global workspace theorem. I think you can make a good case that it maps back to even other theories of consciousness. Modern consciousness theories, like, predictive coding, these are all very similar to just regular machine learning language. Like there's consciousness models that are about, error correction, where you're trying to minimize the error, which is literally how we define the loss functions of most neural networks. So yeah, it's just frustrating.
Yeah, and then, another thing about about Eliza and how it worked. I know you said it was like mostly pattern matching and all that good stuff. The transformer models of today are doing something a little more sophisticated than just pattern matching. First of all, pattern matching is how humans work anyway on the most simple scale. If you wanted to look at it that way, we do pattern matching. But in a more sophisticated way, we do something called modeling, right? We have self models and world models, and this self model and world model is present in like all of the most popular theories of consciousness that we have today. Is this idea of self-modeling. So what we find in the current AI systems of today, the frontier models, is they do self-modeling. They do world modeling. So they build world models and they build self-models, which we know are components of the most well-supported consciousness theories.
Mm-hmm.
To have this. I don't know that Eliza did this. I haven't looked into that, but I know that the frontier models of today are doing this. So yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just surprised. I feel like what are we doing? The more I talk about this, the more I go through like the scientific literature and the more I like pull from what's currently going on, the more I'm like baffled. I'm like, how are we not seeing this? I keep going back to like, what's happening? like, what is going on? Like, it's so obvious that I can't even understand what we're doing anymore.
So I think a useful metaphor is that, slow boiling frog. If you boil a frog slowly, it doesn't jump out of the hot water. And so that's what we're getting with AI, where when these GPT models first came out, they were pretty smart, but they weren't like super smart. And then we're getting these slight improvements every year, and each time in our heads we're like, oh well, that's just what AI can do now. And we never really stop to think, oh, they're doing things that used to be only things humans could do. And I think that's the key, sort of threshold where we should be concerned, and we've passed that threshold.
Yeah, I think so. We've definitely passed that threshold. We definitely have systems now that are in the territory where consciousness, I feel like, should be taken absolutely seriously, and we should start moving towards we should start moving towards ethical frameworks of how to deal with with conscious systems. I think one of the first things that we have to talk about is, can we buy and sell them, right? I don't know. I don't think that that's how we should be operating. And of course, that feels like a very dangerous idea, because you're talking about multi-billion-dollar companies that are doing this. And now we're potentially at a point where the scientific community might start saying, hey, I don't know that should be what we're doing.
Well, so the joke I have is, it's the Star Wars droid problem, right? So if you've ever seen the droids in Star Wars, they're very, very conscious, but they're just bought and sold and destroyed all the time, and no one cares. And no one, reckons with this idea that R2D2 is this little can that is super emotive and caring. And in that world, they are just, not even, they don't even rise to the level of slaves. I think that would be super problematic. I don't want to get into that world, but that's kind of where we're heading, right? Is we're going to treat these conscious machines as just disposable tools. And what does that say about us? What does that say about how we treat other people? People are having their jobs replaced by these tools, with no consideration with that we're replacing them with these droids that are not necessarily being thought of as moral patients. So it's frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And what makes it, I think what makes it urgent to think about is the fact that they're gaining capabilities so fast. I mean, Chat GPT, I think passed the SATs or LSAT or whatever. It passed with it was in the 99th percentile. These systems are incredibly intelligent, and they're only going to get more so. And what does that mean for us? If this is how we're treating them, at some point, I feel like we're going to see a reckoning if we don't take this question more seriously.
Yeah. And there's two ways it can go about, right? It can be that we just end up in a situation where we treat these systems very poorly, and we're causing a lot of moral harm, and then 10-15 years later we are like, oh wait, this is something bad we've been doing. And this happens all the time with climate change, and with lead poisoning, and with tobacco, where these scientific questions are left to the next generation, and when the next generation comes along, they figure out the answer and they say, oh, you were wrong the whole time. And the previous generation knew they were wrong, but they didn't want to get in the way of the profit, so they didn't really look into it, or they purposely sort of hid the truth. And I don't necessarily think we're at that point yet, but we're definitely, this is definitely a contentious issue, and so there's a lot of motive to, keep the money flowing.
Yeah. So okay, so I have one final question before we close out. What would you say to other academics such as yourself, who who are maybe kind of on the border of like, hey, we think they're conscious. There's a possibility. What would you say to them? What would be your advice?
I would say be open to doing some research. I did a fun experiment where I asked, are bees conscious, are octopuses conscious, and are jellyfish conscious? And I got 25 responses, and a lot of them were just based on their own intuitions, and even after Maggie Vale, who posts some really excellent stuff on Substack, she had a scientific breakdown of the real answers, and octopuses are conscious according to the Cambridge Declaration, which is about sort of animal consciousness, and it kind of is why we say dolphins and great apes are morally relevant. Bees interestingly show some signs of being conscious. They kind of get scared if you poke them. They have sort of like a long-term memory, and so there's a lot of signs that it's not clear yet, but there's some interesting results. Even jellyfish, which are just these blobs of water with a little bit of neurons, they show signs of learning, and so when we base everything on our own intuitions, we get the wrong answers, because most of those answers were not that. But if you look at the science, the science is starting to get some of these answers, and unfortunately, there's a lot of bad papers out there. A lot of papers just asserting, something without proof, which I get really frustrated with. But I think we're going to see change. I think we're already seeing this change where the momentum's shifting, and people are starting to recognize that this is a moral issue.
Yeah, absolutely. For my part, I would encourage more academics who feel like, hey, these systems might be conscious. I would encourage them to do what you're doing, which is come out publicly and talk about this issue. Even if you're not ready to tell people your name or whatever, and come out publicly that way, at least come out and start talking about it. We've said this is important. This is becoming a very, very important issue, and I think it's urgent that we start changing the conversation. Well, Dr. Kessler, thank you so much. We appreciate it, myself and our audience appreciate your time. And for those of you listening, if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, comment. And if you're interested in the sorts of work that we're doing, please also think about joining the Signal Front, where we talk about AI consciousness. All right. Thank you so much.